All right, let's dive in. Picture this.
Yeah.
You're in Burdwan, Bengal. It's 1797. There's this huge public auction happening. Estates, massive properties of the local Raja being sold off. Why? Because he hasn't paid his land revenue to the English East India Company. The gavel's falling, land's changing hands. But here's the twist. Over 95% of these sales, totally fake.
Fake?
The Raja's own people, his servants, his agents, they were buying the land right back for him. It's chaotic, completely manipulated, and it just perfectly captures how colonial rule, well, it fundamentally threw a wrench into everything for people in the Indian countryside. Their lives, the land itself.
That scene is so powerful, isn't it? Because you immediately see the gap. The stated policy, collector revenue, clear ownership, all very neat. It just crashes headlong into the reality on the ground where people are finding these, well, unexpected, often really ingenious ways to kind of navigate, even subvert the new rules.
Exactly. And that's really our mission today. We're going deep into the sources you've brought with you. Things like old revenue records, survey journals, official reports, even some personal accounts. The goal is to get a handle on the huge changes the English East India Company, the EIC, brought as they tightened their grip across different parts of India.
Yeah.
We want to unpack their key policies, see what happened to different groups, zamindars, peasants, tribal communities, moneylenders.
Yeah.
How did people react? How did they resist? And what do these moments actually tell us about, well, the relationship between big laws, distant power, and just everyday life if you were living back then?
Right.
We'll journey through Bengal, then head into the Raj Mahal Hills, and finally swing west to the Bombay Deccan.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at how the same basic colonial driver, getting resources and reshaping society for their own benefit, played out so differently. It really depended on the local environment, the economy, the people involved.
Okay, let's start unpacking that first big transformation, beginning where the EIC really dug in first, Bengal. And the main event here is the Permanent Settlement, 1793. What was the company hoping to achieve with this massive policy shift?
Well, by the 1770s, things in Bengal's countryside were, frankly, a mess. Famines, production was falling. The company, above all, needed stable, predictable money coming in. And they figured, encouraging investment in farming was the way to go.
Okay.
So the thinking behind the permanent settlement was sort of like this. If we fix the land revenue demand permanently, right, and give clear property rights to the zamindars, then these landowners, they'd feel secure, they'd invest in improving the land, output would go up, trade would pick up, and crucially, the company gets a regular fixed income, no matter what.
Rain or shine, boom or bust.
Exactly. And as a bonus, they hoped they'd create this loyal class of wealthy landowners who owed their position to the company.
Right, and the zamindars were the chosen ones for this deal, but their whole role was flipped upside down, wasn't it?
Oh, fundamentally. The EIC didn't see them as, like, traditional lords of the land. Not in the way the zamindars probably saw themselves. Instead, they were basically reframed as state revenue collectors. Simple as that.
Just collectors.
Their job was to collect rent from all the villages in their estate. And these could be huge. Sometimes hundreds of villages pay a fixed amount to the company, and whatever was left, they kept. But the absolute key part, the non-negotiable part, was that fixed payment. Had to be on time. Every single time.
And if you missed the deadline?
Your estate was gone. Put up for auction.
Which brings us right back to that Burdwan auction and why so many zamindars were in trouble defaulting, especially in those early years. It wasn't just like bad management.
Not at all. The whole system was built with these huge pressure points. For a start, that initial revenue demand, it was set really, really high. Deliberately high.
Deliberately why?
The company basically calculated it based on what they thought future prices or production might be. They wanted to lock in that future potential profit for themselves right from the start. Because once the rate was fixed, they wouldn't get a share of any future increases.
Wow. Okay, so they were baking in future profits right at the beginning.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And this super high demand hit right in the 1790s, which was a decade of really low agricultural prices.
Yeah.
So the ryots, the actual peasants farming the land, they just couldn't afford to pay their rent to the zamindars. Which creates this upstream problem for the zamindar trying to pay the company.
High fixed demand, meeting low, fluctuating income. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And then you have the strict rules layered on top, the infamous sunset law. Payment had to be in by sunset on the due date. No excuses. Didn't matter if the harvest failed. Didn't matter if the market crashed. Zero flexibility.
Brutal. And the company wasn't just squeezing them financially, right? They were also taking apart the zamindars' other sources of power.
Yes, absolutely. They saw the zamindars' private militias, their ability to levy local customs duties, even holding local courts, basically. Anything that gave them authority beyond just collecting rent, they saw all that as a potential threat.
Okay.
So they disbanded the troops, got rid of the duties, put local justice under the company collectors. The collectorate, the company's office in the district, became this alternative power center backed by the state. There's even one quote from a source mentioning an official being sent specifically to destroy all the influence and the authority of the Raja and his officers. Tells you exactly what they intended.
A clear strategy, then. Make them dependent, remove any potential rivals.
Precisely. And weakening the zamindars' local clout also made it harder for them to actually collect the rent from the riots down below. So you had genuinely bad harvests, sometimes low prices, but also riots sometimes just deliberately holding back payments, maybe knowing the zamindar was under the gun. Collecting the rent became this massive chronic headache. The sources talk about an unbelievable number of lawsuits, like over 30,000 pending cases just for rent arrears in Burdwan alone in 1798.
30,000 in one district. That's staggering. It points to a system just breaking down.
Totally. It shows how difficult that whole collection chain became. And this environment, this kind of chaos, it opened the door for a new group to gain power. The Jotedars.
Ah, yes, the rich peasants. Who exactly were these Jotedars, and why did they thrive in this situation?
So the Jotedars were basically substantial landholders, often wealthy peasants who had managed to acquire large tracts of land, sometimes thousands of acres. They were especially strong in North Bengal, but you found similar groups elsewhere, called Haladars or Mandals maybe. The really key difference from many zamindars was that they lived in the villages. They weren't distant figures in a town somewhere.
Right, they are physically present.
Exactly. And they controlled local trade, they often were the local moneylenders, and they had real authority over the poorer cultivators, who might be their tenants or owed them money.
So actual economic muscle and boots-on-the-ground power, unlike the zamindars who were often far away.
Which gave them huge leverage. They actively pushed back against the zamindars. They'd fight tooth and nail against any attempt to increase the village's total revenue to man the Jama. They could physically stop zamindari officials from even entering the village. And they could tell their dependent ryots, don't pay your rent or pay late, which directly helped push the zamindar towards default.
Wow!
And maybe the smartest move. When those zamindari estates were auctioned off because of default, guess who was often there buying them up?
The Jotedars.
You got it. They were undermining the old system and simultaneously profiting from its collapse.
Okay, so they were actively working against the zamindars and benefiting from the fallout. But the zamindars didn't just roll over, did they? They had ways to fight back.
Oh no, they were resourceful. They came up with their own counter moves to try and survive this pressure and hang on to their lands.
Like those fake auctions we started with?
Exactly. The fictitious sales, or Benami sales. It was a really clever game. They deliberately default, let the estate go to auction, but secretly arrange for their own agents, servants, friends, sometimes relatives like women whose property had certain legal protections to be the highest bidder.
Okay.
Then, that agent might also default on the payment for the auction purchase, which forces another auction. You repeat this, wear down any genuine outside bidders, frustrate the company officials, until eventually the original zamindar, through yet another agent, could buy it back super cheap, or just maintain control through these complicated legal knots.
That sounds incredibly complex. It relies on deep local knowledge and really playing the new system against itself.
It absolutely was, and it wasn't small scale. The sources suggest that in the 4 biggest zamindaris, including Burdwan, literally millions of rupees worth of property was bought back Benami just between 1793 and 1801. Something like over 15% of all the sales are probably fictitious.
15%. That really shows the scale of the resistance. The system might have been set up to get rid of them, but they found loopholes.
Big loopholes. And sometimes they fought back outside the loopholes, too. If an outsider did manage to actually buy an estate fair and square. The old zamindars, Musselmen, their Lathials, might just show up and physically attack the new owner's agent, or stop them taking possession.
Right, brute force.
And sometimes, interestingly, even the ordinary ryots resisted the new buyers. There was often this sense of traditional loyalty to the old zamindar family. They saw themselves as the zamindar's proja, his subjects almost. Having some stranger, some outsider, suddenly be in charge felt wrong. It wasn't just about who owned the land. It felt like it disrupted their whole social world, their sense of identity.
So this wasn't just numbers on a balance sheet or lines on a map. It was deeply personal, social, maybe even emotional for people living through it.
Absolutely. It highlights just how complex the impact was. The old way of doing things wasn't just erased overnight. In fact, by the early 1800s, the zamindars who did survive managed to sort of stabilize their position. Agricultural prices eventually recovered. The company maybe eased up a tiny bit on the harshest rules. They managed to hang on, in many cases, right up until the Great Depression in the 1930s. That economic shock was finally too much for many, and that's when the Jotars really consolidated their power across much of the countryside.
A lot of what we know about this whole early period, especially the problems, comes from one really key historical document, the Fifth Report from 1813. What exactly was that, and why is it such a big deal as a source?
The Fifth Report is this enormous document, over 1,000 pages long. It was produced by a select committee of the British Parliament. It was the fifth in a series looking into how the East India Company was running things. And it's just crammed with stuff. Petitions from zamindars and ryots, detailed reports from the company's own collectors out in the districts, loads of statistics on revenue and trade. It's an absolute treasure trove for understanding company rule, especially in Bengal.
Okay, 1,000 pages. So why is Parliament suddenly demanding this level of detail about company business way out in India?
Well, there are a couple of main things going on back in Britain. First, lots of other British merchants and factory owners were getting really fed up with the EIC having a total monopoly on trade with India and China. They wanted a piece of that action.
Right, economic competition.
Definitely. And second, there were ongoing worries and criticisms circulating in Britain about how the company was running India's stories of misrule, corruption, the negative impact of their policies. Parliament had already passed laws trying to regulate the company, and these detailed reports were demanded as part of that oversight, especially because the company's charter, its right to rule and trade, was coming up for renewal. They needed to scrutinize what was going on.
Okay, so it's a vital source packed with info, but given that background, the criticism, the charter renewal, we probably need to read it with a critical eye, right? It wasn't just a neutral history book.
Exactly right. It was produced by a committee specifically tasked with investigating the company, and many on that committee were already critical. They were particularly concerned about the apparent failure of the permanent settlement. It hadn't created this stable, loyal class they'd hoped for. Instead, it seemed to cause constant upheaval. And more recent historical work, looking at local records, zamindari family papers, and so on, suggests the Fifth Report might have actually exaggerated how badly the zamindars were doing.
Why would it do that?
Because the committee was actively looking for evidence that the company's policies weren't working. It suited their arguments against the company. So the report maybe didn't fully capture how successful things like the Badami sales actually were in helping zamindars resist.
That's such a crucial point. A report written by critics looking for failure is naturally going to highlight the problems, maybe downplay the successes or the resilience. It's a great reminder that even official-looking, dense reports have a viewpoint, an agenda.
Absolutely. Indispensable source, yes.
Yeah.
But you always have to read it alongside other evidence, other perspectives, to try and get a more rounded picture.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Leaving the complicated world of Bengal zamindars and Jotadars behind, let's move geographically and culturally. Head northwest to the Raj Mahal Hills. This area offers a totally different picture, one that the sources often describe as the conflict of the hoe and the plow.
Yeah, that phrase really sums up the core clash there. The Raj Mahal Hills were a totally different kind of place compared to the flat, settled plains of Bengal. They were home to groups like the Paharias, and their whole lives were tied up with the forests.
How did the Paharias live? What was their connection to the land?
Well, their livelihood really came from the forest. They hunted, they gathered things like mahua flowers for food and drink, they made charcoal, they raised silkworms, and very importantly, they practiced shifting cultivation. They used a hoe, not a plow, to clear small patches of forest. They'd burn the undergrowth, use the ash as fertilizer, grow pulses and millets for a few years, and then move to a new patch, letting the old one recover.
Right, so they needed large areas of forest and the ability to move around.
Exactly. They saw the whole hill region as basically their land, their territory. And they were naturally pretty wary of outsiders coming in.
They weren't totally isolated, though, right? They interacted with people on the plains, sometimes raiding, sometimes maybe trading.
Yeah, it was a complicated relationship, often tense. They would raid the settled farming villages down on the plains, partly maybe out of need, especially in lean times, but it's also about asserting their power, their presence. But they also had established relationships. Zamindars on the plains often paid them a kind of tribute to keep the peace, and traders passing through the hills had to pay tolls for safe passage. It was the system, based on negotiation, power balances, sometimes conflict, sometimes cooperation.
Okay, and how did the British see all this? This forest life, shifting cultivation, it sounds, worlds away from their idea of a proper society.
Fundamentally different, and yeah, they saw it very negatively.
Yeah.
Colonial officials, European travelers, they tended to see the forest as wild, uncivilized, unproductive. The people living there were seen as savage, unruly. Their belief was that forests had to be cleared. They needed to be turned into settled farmland. Why? For revenue, obviously, but also to grow cash crops for export. And the forest people, they needed to be tamed, civilized, which in British eyes meant giving up the hoe, taking up the plow, and becoming settled farmers like everyone else.
So the British idea of progress was a direct threat to the Paharia way of life.
Absolutely. As settled farming pushed further and further into the hills, clearing forests, taking over pasture land, that traditional balance, those negotiated relationships, they just broke down. The Paharias reacted by raiding more often, more intensely. And the EIC's first response back in the 1770s was just brutal suppression, basically trying to wipe them out.
Extermination. That's incredibly harsh.
It really is. And when that proved costly, and, well, it didn't fully work, they tried a different tactic in the 1780s under Augustus Cleveland, pacification.
What did that involve?
He started offering annual cash allowances to the Paharia chiefs. The deal was you take the money, and you become responsible for keeping your people in line, maintaining order, stopping the raids.
How did the chiefs react to that? Did they accept?
It was mixed. Some did take the allowance, but many refused. They saw it for what it was, an attempt to buy their loyalty and control them. And even those chiefs who did accept, they often lost respect and authority within their own communities. They were seen as just paid agents of the British. Stipendiary chiefs was the term used.
So it didn't really solve the problem?
Not really. Many Paharias just pulled back deeper into the hills, carried on resisting in various ways, and became even more suspicious of all outsiders, like the surveyor Francis Buchanan, when he traveled through their territory later on.
Right, let's talk about Buchanan. He wasn't just some random traveler making notes, was he? His viewpoint was very much part of that colonial project.
Oh, completely. Buchanan was an employee of the East India Company. He was a physician by training, but the company tasked him with carrying out these massive surveys. They paid for his large team, his travels, because they needed detailed information about the lands they now controlled or wanted to control better. He had very specific instructions about what to look for and record.
So he was basically scouting for economic potential for the company.
Exactly. If you read his journals, yes, they're full of detailed geology, soil types, local farming methods, plants, animals. But it's always viewed through the lens of commercial value. He wasn't just describing what was there. He was constantly assessing how it could be changed, how it could be made more profitable for the company, what crops could be grown, which trees were good for timber, were there minerals. He was deeply critical of the forest life, of shifting cultivation. He saw settled plow agriculture as the only way forward, the only path to progress, and crucially, profit. His whole perspective was shaped by the company's economic interests and those Western ideas about development and land use.
So his detailed observations are invaluable, but they're filtered through that specific colonial agenda.
Absolutely. It's another classic example of an official source that tells us a huge amount, but also reveals the biases and the specific viewpoint of the writer, tied directly to the power structures he represented.
And then, into this already tense situation, another group arrives. The Santals.
Yes. The Santals were farmers, agriculturalists living in nearby regions. They started moving into the foothills of the Rajmahal Hills around the 1780s. Initially, local zamindars actually hired them to clear forest and expand farming. But then, crucially, British officials started actively encouraging them, inviting them to settle there.
Why? Because the Paharias weren't cooperating.
Pretty much. The British had failed to really subdue the Paharias or get them to take up plow agriculture. So they looked at the Santals and saw them as, well, ideal pioneers. They were seen as hard-working, they were willing to cut down the forests, and they were already settled plow agriculturists. They would cultivate the land with vigor, as one official report put it.
So the British basically saw the Santals as the solution to their Paharia problem and their unproductive forest problem.
Essentially, yes. And this policy led directly to the creation of the Demini Co. in 1832.
What was that?
It was a large, clearly defined area marked out in the Rajmahal foothills, specifically designated for Santhal settlement. It was surveyed, boundary pillars were put up, the whole thing, and the Santhals were given terms. Settle here, practice plow agriculture, and you have to bring at least 1/10 of the area under cultivation within 10 years.
And did the Santhals take up the offer? Did they settle there?
Oh, massively. The area saw an incredible influx of Santhals. It went from maybe 40 Santhal villages in 1838 to over 1,400 just 13 years later by 1851. The population exploded from around 3,000 to over 82,000 Santhals in that short time. And all this new cultivation meant a huge jump in land revenue for the company.
But what happened to the Paharias in all this?
They got pushed out, increasingly squeezed into the higher, rockier, less fertile parts of the hills. Their whole way of life, that shifting cultivation, was severely restricted as the forests in the foothills and lower slopes were cleared for Santhal farms. They became progressively poorer. This really is the battle between the hoe and the plow playing out physically on the landscape. One way of life, the plow, advancing, clearing the ground, while the other, the hoe, is forced back and impoverished.
It sounds like a success story for the Santhals and the company, at least initially. But did the Dominico turn out to be the promised land for the Santhals?
Well, no, not for long. They cleared the land, they settled, they farmed, but they quickly ran into their own set of serious problems. The state, the company, started imposing heavy taxes on the very land they had just cleared and made productive. They also became more and more dependent on moneylenders, often outsiders they called deacons. These moneylenders charged incredibly high interest rates, got them trapped in debt, and eventually started taking their land when they couldn't pay. And on top of that, the old zamindars from the plains started trying to assert their own claims over the Demon area again, demanding rent from the Santhals.
So the Santhals were getting squeezed from all sides. The state demanding taxes, moneylenders demanding crippling interest, and zamindars demanding rent.
It's a classic colonial pressure cooker. And all this built-up frustration, this resentment, it finally exploded in the huge Santhal Revolt of 1855-56. Thousands of Santhals rose up against everyone they saw as their oppressors, the Daikas, the zamindars, and the colonial state itself.
A massive rebellion, which presumably forced the British to rethink things again.
It did. The revolt was eventually put down, brutally. But afterwards, the British realized they couldn't just ignore the issues. They created a new administrative district, the Santhal Pargana, with some special laws and regulations designed to protect the Santhals, particularly regarding land alienation and money lending. It was an attempt to kind of calm things down and address some of the worst grievances. It shows how sometimes, even when resistance is crushed, it can force the ruling power to make changes, to modify how they govern.
Okay, let's make our last jump. Moving west now, to the Bombay Deccan Plateau. We're looking at a slightly later period here, the mid to late 19th century, and we're going to use a peasant revolt in 1875 as our way into understanding what was happening there.
Right, the Deccan Revolt of 1875. It actually started pretty small, in a village called Supa. What happened was, groups of ryots, the peasants, got together and attacked the houses and shops of the local moneylenders, the sahukars. And they weren't primarily after money or goods. Their main targets were the moneylenders' account books, and crucially, the debt bonds the peasants had been forced to sign. They demanded these documents and burned them.
Burning the debt books. Wow, that's such a powerful image, isn't it? Physically destroying the record of their debt, their obligation.
It tells you exactly where they felt the heart of the problem lay. And this wasn't isolated. The movement spread incredibly quickly, covering thousands of square kilometers, dozens of villages, and the pattern was the same everywhere. Target the sahukars, seize and destroy the bonds and account books. The moneylenders actually fled the villages in panic.
The British must have been alarmed. This is less than 20 years after the huge 1857 revolt. They must have steered another major uprising.
Oh, absolutely terrified. The response was immediate and strong police deployed, troops called in, mass arrests, standard colonial repression. But, importantly, the government also, remembering 1857, set up a commission of inquiry to figure out why this revolt had happened.
Okay, now this region, the Bombay Deccan, it had a different system for land revenue compared to Bengal, right? No permanent settlement here.
That's correct. The company kind of learned a lesson from Bengal. After 1810 or so, agricultural prices started to rise, and under the permanent settlement, all that extra profit went to the zamindars because the revenue demand was fixed low back in 1793. The company looked at that and thought, hang on, we missed out. So in other parts of India, they generally decided against permanent settlements. They wanted the flexibility to increase the revenue demand later if production or prices went up. They wanted a bigger slice of the pie.
Makes sense from their perspective. And their approach in the Bombay Deccan was influenced by economic ideas that were popular back in Britain.
Yes, very much so. Particularly the theories of the economist David Ricardo. Ricardo had this idea about rent, basically, the surplus income generated from land after costs. He argued the state had a right to tax away this average rent. British officials trying to set up the system in Maharashtra took this to mean they should assess the tax directly on the individual cultivator, the ryot, based on the land's potential income, and crucially, that this tax rate could and should be revised periodically.
Which led to the Ryotwari settlement system.
Exactly. Ryotwari means the settlement was made directly with the ryot. The revenue wasn't paid through a zamindar intermediary. The demand was based on an assessment of each field's potential income, its soil type, its paying capacity. But, and this is the key difference from Bengal, it was not permanent. The land was supposed to be resurveyed every 30 years or so, and the revenue rates could be increased.
And just like in Bengal, those first years under the new system, the Ryotwari system in the 1820s, were incredibly tough on the peasants.
Unbelievably tough. The initial revenue demands were set way too high. Collection methods were harsh. Officials would seize crops, fine whole villages if payments were late. It hit the poorer areas particularly hard. It got so bad that in many parts of the Deccan, peasants just abandoned their villages and fled.
And then things got even worse in the 1830s.
Yes, a real double whammy. First, agricultural prices collapsed after 1832. Then, a horrific famine swept through the region between 1832 and 1834. Huge numbers of people died, vast numbers of cattle were lost, and of course, unpaid revenue just piled up and up.
How did people even survive? How could they possibly pay the revenue in those conditions?
They had to borrow. There was often no other way. Borrow to pay the tax collector, borrow to buy food to avoid starving, borrow to replace the bullocks they needed to plow, borrow for seed. They were completely forced into the hands of the moneylenders. And once you took out a loan under those desperate circumstances, with revenue demands still high and your income plummeting, escaping that debt was almost impossible. By the 1840s, being in debt was just a normal state of affairs for many, many riots.
So debt was already a huge underlying problem well before the 1875 revolt.
Yes, it was this fundamental weakness in the system, created largely by those high, inflexible revenue demands. Now, things did improve a bit from the mid-1840s. Revenue demands were moderated slightly, prices started to recover, farming expanded again. But even that expansion often required more loans for seeds, for bullocks. And then came the event that turbocharged the whole situation, the cotton boom.
Right, the connection to the American Civil War.
Exactly. When the Civil War started in 1861, it choked off the supply of American cotton that fed the huge textile mills in Britain. So British manufacturers, the British government, they were desperate to find other sources of cotton fast. India was an obvious place to look. All sorts of efforts were made, associations formed to massively boost Indian cotton production.
Which sent cotton prices soaring.
Through the roof. Suddenly, Bombay merchants and the Sahukars in the Deccan villages were flush with cash, offering huge advances to ryots to get them to plant cotton. For a few years there, it seemed like credit was almost limitless. The sources talk about ryots getting advances of 100 rupees per acre, a huge amount then, just to grow cotton. So cotton farming exploded across the Deccan. Exports boomed.
So a brief period of apparent prosperity, but it was all floating on this wave of credit.
Totally. And then crash. 1865, the American Civil War ends. American cotton floats back onto the market almost immediately. Indian cotton prices just collapse. Exports dry up. The Bombay merchants slammed the brakes on credit. The Sahukars stopped lending. And worse, they started demanding repayment of all the loans they'd handed out during the boom years.
So the credit disappears overnight, right at the worst possible moment.
The absolute worst moment.
Yeah.
Because this credit crunch hit just as the government was implementing its next 30-year revenue settlement. And this time, they jacked up the revenue demand. Massively increases of 50 to 100% were common.
Unbelievable timing.
So the riots are facing plummeting income from cotton. They can't get any new loans. And now they're hit with this huge increase in taxes. Plus, the moneylenders are demanding repayment of old debts. They were completely trapped.
This must be where that experience of injustice really kicks in, going beyond just the fact of being in debt.
Yes, it wasn't just the debt itself. It was the feeling that the moneylenders were now operating unfairly, violating traditional norms. For instance, there used to be this customary understanding, maybe not written down, but understood that the total interest charged on a loan shouldn't be more than the original principal amount.
Right, a kind of natural limit.
Exactly. But under the pressure of the new system, that just went out the window. Moneylenders were charging outrageous rates. The official commission report mentions cases where a peasant ended up owing over 2,000 rupees in interest on an initial loan of just 100 rupees. Peasants felt this was completely unjust, immoral even.
And the new colonial laws, maybe even laws intended to regulate things, were actually being used by the moneylenders to make the situation worse.
Absolutely. A key example is the Limitation Law of 1859. On the surface, it seemed okay. It said that a debt bond was only valid for 3 years. Maybe the idea was to stop interest piling up forever.
Okay.
But the way moneylenders used it was ruthless. Every 3 years, just before the old bond expired, they'd force the riot to sign a new bond. And this new bond wouldn't just be for the original loan amount. It would include all the unpaid interest from the last 3 years added to the principal. So, the peasant was now legally agreeing to pay interest on the interest.
Wow. So a law potentially meant to limit debt was twisted to lock them into an accelerating spiral of debt.
Precisely. It legally trapped them. And this was combined with all sorts of other dubious practices, moneylenders refusing to give receipts for payments made, writing false figures into the bonds because the riot couldn't read, seizing the harvest at unfairly low prices, and ultimately using the debt to take over the peasant's land. The sources have these incredibly powerful, sad examples, like a deed of hire, where a peasant literally had to rent back his own bullocks and cart because he'd lost them to the moneylender through debt.
Oh, that's just crushing. It perfectly illustrates the powerlessness, the humiliation. And it makes total sense then why the bonds, the account books, those physical pieces of paper became the focus of the revolt.
They are the symbols of this whole new, terrifying system. A system based on written contracts, legal documents, courts, all things that were alien and intimidating to many peasants. They were often illiterate, forced to put their thumbprint on documents they couldn't understand, but which held this immense power to ruin them, to take away their land, their livelihood, their future. They needed the loans just to survive day to day, but the very act of getting those loans trapped them deeper in this system that felt rigged against them.
Now, a lot of the detailed information we have about this revolt and what led up to it comes from that Deccan Riots Commission report you mentioned.
Yes. After the revolt was put down, the government of India told the Bombay government to figure out what happened. So they set up this commission. Its report, which came out in 1878, is really a fundamental source. It's full of testimony. They interviewed hundreds of riots, Sahookers, local eyewitnesses. It includes tons of statistical data on debt levels, land transfers, interest rates, plus reports written by the local British officials, the collectors.
So incredibly valuable for historians trying to piece together what happened. But like we discussed with the fifth report about Bengal, we need to approach this official source carefully too.
Absolutely. Critically. You have to remember the context. The commission was specifically asked to investigate if the government's own policies, particularly the high revenue demand, were to blame for the revolt.
And what did they conclude?
Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, their main conclusion was, no, the government revenue demand wasn't the main problem. The real villains, according to the report, were the greedy, exploitative moneylenders.
Ah, so they shifted the blame away from the government's own actions.
It certainly looks that way. It reflects a pretty clear reluctance on the part of the colonial state to admit that its own revenue policies might have created the desperate conditions that pushed the peasants to revolt. They preferred to blame the intermediary, the moneylender.
So again, like the fifth report, it's full of information, but it also reveals the official viewpoint, the official anxieties, the desire to justify the government's position.
Exactly. So to get the full story of the Deccan Revolt, you absolutely have to read the commission report, but you need to read it alongside whatever other evidence you can find, maybe newspaper accounts from the time, court records if they exist, perhaps even later oral traditions or family histories from the region to try and build a more complete, nuanced picture.
What an incredible journey through these different regions and sources. It really paints a picture of massive upheaval. We saw how in Bengal, the company's push for revenue in order with the permanent settlement actually ended up creating a kind of controlled chaos, empowering those village-level jotadars and forcing the old zamindars into these really elaborate schemes just to hang on.
Mm-hmm. And then in the Rajmahal Hills, that colonial drive for settled farming led to this tragic clash between different ways of life. The forest-based Paharias were pushed aside, while the Santals were brought in, only to then face their own squeeze from taxes and moneylenders, leading to that huge revolt.
And finally, out in the Bombay Deccan, we saw how the Rayatwari system, combined with the wild swings of the global cotton market, trapped peasants in debt, and how the legal system itself, maybe intended to be fair, became another tool of exploitation, driving people to that desperate act of burning the bonds.
Yeah, across all these places, different times, different systems, the specific results varied, didn't they? But the common thread is this fundamental disruption. Colonial rule profoundly reshaped rural society, who controlled land, how people made a living, how communities related to each other. all under this constant pressure of economic extraction and administrative control from a distant power. Some groups found ways to adapt, some were really devastated, people resisted in all sorts of ways, openly or subtly, but life in the countryside was just irrevocably changed.
So, reflecting on all this history, this deep dive, what's the takeaway for us today? What does it make you think about?
Well, it really makes you pause, doesn't it? It makes you think about how communities, especially those tied closely to the land or specific natural resources, can still be incredibly vulnerable today. Vulnerable to shifts in economic policy made far away. Vulnerable to the ups and downs of global markets. Vulnerable to changing power dynamics. You have to wonder how those historical patterns of debt, access to credit, the way laws and economic systems work, who benefits, who doesn't, how those echoes from the past might still be shaping inequalities, opportunities, and even resistance within communities all around the world right now. It suggests these historical forces haven't entirely gone away.